Welcome to the Institute for Management Studies Leadership Conversations podcast, where we have leading thought leaders discussing their research and identifying ways that you can incorporate it to take your learning and development to the next level. Welcome, everyone, to the IMS Leadership Conversations podcast. My name is Charles Good, the president of the Institute for Management Studies and your host for this podcast. This podcast is designed to highlight relevant research and practical applications from esteemed leadership experts and practitioners. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by best-selling author and leadership thought leader, Dr. Carol Kinsey Goman, who is a best-selling author of 13 business books, including The Silent Language of Leaders, How Body Language Can Help or Hurt How You Lead, and her newest bestseller, Stand Out, How to Build Your Leadership Presence. Welcome, Carol. Thank you for joining us today.
It is my pleasure. I'm really glad to be here.
Today, I wanted to focus with you on one of the topics that you're an expert in and passionate about, and that's leadership presence. And this concept, it seems like it receives more and more attention in the media. And many senior leaders continually say that when they're asked by individuals on what it takes to rise at any organization, especially to higher and higher levels, they usually state executive or leadership presence. With that being said, there's many definitions of this concept. Some describe it as a combination of self-confidence, poise, authenticity that impacts your ability to inspire others. Others say somewhat more matter-of-fact by stating it's the ability to command a room. In hearing in the past the way you've defined and described it, which you say it's that elusive quality that we know when we see it, but it's hard to define. Can you elaborate on that and what you consider to be a good definition of this term?
I think my favorite definition, and the one that I keep changing as the world evolves and I evolve, but I really look at leadership presence now as a combination of habits, some verbal habits and some nonverbal habits that put together project that elusive quality so that it's what people think about you. It's how you come across to other people, which makes it very different than leadership ability. Leadership ability, or actually being credible or confident, etc., is one aspect, but being able to portray confidence and credibility is really another aspect. It's how you say what you say, it's what you say, and it's how you look when you say it. Or as I had one of my clients said, it's what people say about me after I leave the room.
I love that. And it's great to hear that explanation and defining in those terms, because sometimes with these elusive concepts, it's almost a worthwhile exercise to define a term by what it is not. So can you give some examples of what you consider it not to be?
Absolutely. It is not your title. You can have the title of leader and have no leadership presence or minimal leadership presence. You cannot have the title of leader and have tremendous leadership presence. So it's not a reflection of your title. It's not a reflection of your technical expertise or even your innate leadership ability or potential. Again, it is really totally dependent on how other people perceive you. So it's the impression that you make. So you can be authentically credible, and yet your communication style or your body language or another one of your communication habits interferes with people seeing how authentically credible you are, which of course is my favorite point to start on. And that is, when you're building leadership presence, it's not a matter of faking it till you make it. It's a matter of understanding your innate value, not only your inner values, but your innate value to an organization, and being able to display those values and that value to the organization in ways that are authentic and congruent with your best authentic self.
Well, that's great. And that really brings into that credibility, like you said, that first one of being perceived as being competent and knowledgeable. You go on to identify 5 qualities that are at the core of leadership presence. The first one's credibility, and that you indicate in your book that you state that there's one word that you can add when making requests of someone that's going to greatly impact their compliance. Can you share what that one word is?
Yeah, this came from a study at Stanford, if I'm remembering correctly from where I pulled that for the book, in which they were looking at how many people would allow you to cut in line and use a copier. And they found that a certain percentage, if you just said, "Oh, may I please cut in line? I would like to use this copier," would allow you in. But that jumped to almost 90% if you added one word. And that word was because. So, may I please get in front of you because my boss needs this? Or may I please get in front of you because I'd like to? It almost didn't matter what you said after the because. The word because became a very interesting trigger to allowing someone to give you that space.
Are there some tips that you can give for a person to become more credible or appear more credible? Because you said it's about values and the value statement, but any tips that you can share? I know that you talk a little bit in the book as well about going into the heart and head model, which I've seen done by another IMS educator, Dr. Barbara Troutline, and how do you speak to individuals to convey that presence, that confidence?
It is one of those hacks or tips, if you will, that I use all the time. And that is if I'm going to write a book or write an article or make a speech, I go to the end, which is I asked, what do I want my audience to know? So, what is in the head? So, what facts or data or examples do they need to hear so that I can get my main points across? Secondly, the heart. What do I want my audience to feel? And that is, what emotions am I after? In my case, what I'd like them to feel almost always is enthused and motivated and ready to take action, which is the next one in hands. And that is, what do you want your audience to do? Now, when you present something in that format, the one thing that I notice is missing the most is the hands. So you might be very good at giving all the data and using stories, which is a wonderful way to elicit emotional reactions, but you forget to ask them. Now, here's what I want you to do with this. I want you to sign my petition. I want you to join my team. I need your financial support. Whatever it is, if you don't ask for that hands, you've just given them a bunch of things to hear and to feel.
That's great. Love that model that can be used to display more credibility. Let's move into the next concept, and that's confidence. Confidence could be argued as the trait that's most strongly correlated with leadership presence, but also the one that's the most difficult to master. Why do you think that is?
Well, here's where credibility and confidence intersect. We have, and when I say we, I mean all of us, have fallen into a myth around confidence and credibility. And that is, we tend to believe that people who are confident are also credible. Now, when you think back on your experience, you will probably realize that you've worked with or for people that looked very confident and didn't know what they were talking about.
Absolutely.
So it's really an erroneous assumption that we make, but it is tightly linked. So it is very important to appear credible. You need to also look confident. And that's one of the difficult things, because you may be very credible and you may not have a high level of self-confidence. And of course, confidence starts internally with things like overcoming that little voice we have, the imposter syndrome voice that tells us that we really don't deserve to be there, and that if they really knew about us, we'd never get hired again, or they wouldn't give us that project,
Right.
or whatever that is. So it's an internal beginning, but it's manifested by things like how you say what you say and how you look when you say it. So body language comes in amazingly powerfully when it comes to displaying confidence.
Well, we're going to get into that more in a little while, but I definitely agree with you that turning your inner critic into your inner coach is important because many people, including myself, many times have gone down that path, right? Where that negative self-talk just keeps reinforcing your belief and it's hard to stop that. And also remembering that people are evaluating your confidence by what you say. So I thought we could do this. From your book, there are several ways in which you diminish your confidence by how you say certain things. So if you don't mind, I'm going to say different sentences and I'm going to pause after each sentence. And I'm going to display one of those examples that you used in your book that diminishes my confidence. And if you could speak to that and just say, here's how you can say it better. Does that sound good?
All right, let's give it a go.
All right. So the first example is, I'm no expert, but you may want to do this project in the following manner.
Yeah, the minute you say, I'm no expert, why should anybody listen to you?
Exactly.
It is far better. Now, you may not be an expert, but don't announce it first. Either if you're not an expert and it's really not worth saying, don't say it. But if you're going to say it, own it.
So those qualifiers, try to eliminate those qualifiers that you state in your.
Absolutely. I could be wrong. If I recall correctly, this may not be a good idea, but all of those things say, forget about listening to the rest of what I'm going to say because it's not worth your time.
Well, and I found that those are also using the word but, right? Because they qualify and then the word but is used to have that statement. So that might be an indicator to the person stating it that if they use that word, but hang on, you may be weakening your confidence or your speech by mentioning a qualifier.
Yeah, that's a good clue there.
Next one is this example. I really don't want to be a nuisance here, but I really am struggling with, this concept.
Well, a lot of people do this. We put in ms, ahs, ers, and we do that because we're very uncomfortable with silence. And my biggest tip for this is really understand the power of the pause. So you will eliminate or reduce those uhs. And by the way, if you don't know if you do that, record yourself. It's scary, but it's one great way to find out because I have worked with some amazingly top-notch leaders who have that habit because they just don't like silence. So get used to pausing, letting people understand what you've just said. And this is particularly effective on virtual or podcasts, where if you keep talking, you just run out everything that you're going to say together, even though you're not saying or it's just not a good way to speak. So the power of the pause is my best tip for that.
That's great. Those filler words can just be detrimental. I know that even in the younger generation, like with my kids, they use the word like a great deal. Well, like I need help on this project, like to know like where to start. And it's just another instance where in some cases, I feel like they don't even know they're saying it, right? And it's being more deliberate in practicing it. So you can hopefully remove some of those when it really counts so that you exude effective communication.
And that's another word, that word right that you just used. I've seen people and heard people use that. And here's what I'm talking about, right? So you get what I mean, right? And
exactly. And I didn't even know I was using it. Right.
But you only used it once, and using anything once or twice is great. But when I hear people do that, I get so mesmerized. I start counting the word like rather than
there you go.
What you're saying.
I've done that myself.
Totally diminishes the power of your credibility and the power of your confidence.
I couldn't agree with you more. Let's move to the next one, and that's composure. In staying calm and collected under pressure to appear more confident. And I'm reminded of a statement by one of my mentors, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. And he used to say, it is the calm and collected person that has the power in the room. Don't give away your power authority by losing your temper.
That I think he is right. He or she is right on, because I have a huge extended family. So somebody is always doing something that I can use their story. And one of my members of the extended family is in the police force. And he's not the only member, but he's the one who told me this story. He said, Carol, it doesn't matter what your title is. When it's a chaotic situation, when it's a life or death situation, you will become the de facto leader by remaining calm under pressure because people will automatically turn to you. So it is a powerful set of skills.
That's great. And I think that's something that's desirable. The other technique that I've used to my benefit, and give me your thoughts on this, is I know mindfulness works or other forms of meditation, especially with breath work, but another tool I use is bringing to mind an image of someone who exudes this quality very well. The person that I default to, and I'm dating myself here, is David Carradine. He's best known for his role in the 1970 TV series Kung Fu. And regardless of what was happening in the situation with the fight, he was always cool, calm, and collected. And bringing to mind that image brings to me that certain calmness that helps me in situations that I find stressful.
I think that imagery is an incredibly powerful tool here, whether it's a person that like you with David Carradine, or whether it's a place. You know, if you have a place in mind that relaxes you, a a camping trip that you took, or your couch, whatever it might be, where when you think of that, it triggers and reminds you of those relaxed feelings. That can be very helpful. Another thing to do is do what an actor does, or actually a comic. My husband was for 17 years a professional stand-up comedian. And when he would get heckled, he would have which is a very stressful situation, he would have the best responses. Now, he didn't have the best responses because he automatically thought of something wonderful, although that sometimes happens to him and to us, but because he knew the kinds of things that were likely to be said, and he had rehearsed his spontaneous responses. If you are going into a situation where you can anticipate what may be thrown at you and you can rehearse how you want to respond, that's another place where imagery can be very, very powerful.
No, that's great. And I definitely agree with situations that you might encounter in the future. If you can plan those out, those help greatly in identifying the right response. I couldn't agree more. How about with connection? Connection is the fourth in these pieces to improve your leadership presence. And this has really gotten a lot of attention with emotional intelligence, being able to relate to other people more empathetically and to find some common ground. And I love how it ties into body language because the formal term is isopraxism, but you try to mirror the other person's gestures. People that get along well, that feel that instant connection, they find that they mirror certain gestures in one another. Can you elaborate on that or identify some other areas in which they can relate more empathetically to other people?
Yes, the mirroring happens because of our mirror neurons in our brain, that when we are genuinely connected with someone else, and you'll find that with your best friend or your spouse on a good day, as I always say, it is an amazingly automatic thing that your body will do, and that it will start to mimic the person that you're talking to. Now, when you do that as a technique, that because you want to be more empathetic and more in that other person's shoes, by mimicking their body language in a very subtle way, so it doesn't look like you're making fun of them,
Right.
you can actually get into their feelings. So if have their arms tightly crossed, or they're leaning way back, or they're leaning way forward, you can pick up cues and you can mimic some of those cues that say, I understand how you're feeling. I know how this must be for you. Yeah, you can do that obviously verbally as well, but when you do that with your body, it's a very subtle way of displaying that emotional connection.
Right. And then finally, charisma. Charisma in my opinion, is almost an accumulation of all these, that if you have these four, that you're going to be a more charismatic person. But the one thing that I also notice too, when I look at people that exude this, that show this, is that they're authentic, right? You can't be charismatic if you're perceived as a fake or phony or not true to yourself. What are your thoughts around charisma? Because it's that natural charm, but I find it very difficult to define as well.
It is difficult to define. And I'm right with you that it goes back to where we started, and that is authenticity. Authenticity has to be the base for all of this, because you can't fake well enough with the people that you're dealing with all the time. And the minute they see that you are faking it, you've lost all leadership presence. Now, when I look at charismatic leaders that I have dealt with in the past, either spoken to or coached or been hired by, I notice that they don't necessarily have all of those characteristics. What they have, some do, by the way, but if they have an authentic strength in, let's say, their credibility, they can be really bad in some of the other areas. For example, there was a chief executive officer that I worked with, or worked for actually, in New York. The man was one of the worst speakers I had ever heard. He odd through every speech he gave.
Wow.
He was not at all what one would call charismatic. But when he gave an all hands presentation, and this was time I could actually sit in the audience,
Right.
people were mesmerized by this man because he had come in at the bottom of the organization. He had done just about every job in that organization. And when he spoke, it was from such a deep well of credibility that was really all he needed to be charismatic.
That's a great story. And that's makes a whole lot of sense, so that you don't have to work on all of these, but if you really are very well versed or exude that in one area, that could carry it through.
Well, I think working on all of them is a good thing. I try to do that myself. But I do think that knowing where your strength is so that you can optimize that authentically is a huge part of being charismatic. And of course, the other part of being charismatic goes right back to connection, because the most charismatic leaders I have ever worked with, you go out of their office and you think, oh my goodness, I'm the most wonderful person on the planet. Not they're the most wonderful person, because they've made you feel so amazingly good about yourself. So they have that ability to connect and to support and to motivate, and it makes them incredibly charismatic.
Well, and that's good, right? Because you should be operating from a strength-based leadership model, and you should be looking to ways to connect these two. And a lot of these concepts, like you said, overlap.
Yeah.
And I love your statement, how you say that many leaders, however, are non-verbally illiterate. And this is alarming, because you could argue that a great deal of our communication with others is coming by way of what is not said versus what is said. And
Absolutely.
And in your book, Stand Out, the more you know about body language, you argue, the more you're going to look like a competent, compassionate leader who exudes leadership presence. So I'd love to transition into more of these body language tips and tools and strategies. And I love this topic. I've read a lot of books, all of yours, which are some of my favorites. Paul Ekman has a great one, Jim Navarro on What Everybody is Saying. And what I've learned to really do this effectively, to look at body language in others and read them effectively, I found that you need to be first a competent observer of your environment, and also try to establish baseline behaviors within each individual. Can you go into a little more depth on that?
Yeah, I actually got interested in this iteration of my career when I was working with executives who were giving speeches on change management. And I was doing a lot of research in that. And I noticed that if the executive wasn't totally sold on the change, him or herself, which is why we go back to authenticity,
Right.
It leaked out in their body language. So that what I mean by that was they would say a declarative positive statement and very subtly be shaking their head no, or shrugging their shoulders, or pulling back, or doing some other when I say negative, I mean body language that negates a positive statement signal. Now, people in the audience, interestingly enough, did not say, oh, they were just talking about XYZ, but their body did ABC. They didn't make that conscious connection. What they came out saying were things like, I don't know. Do you think this is going to be okay? There was something about that. They didn't exactly know what was going on, but they knew that something wasn't in sync, which is the main objective of body language. There are no good or bad body language signals. There are body language signals that are congruent with or out of alignment with your verbal statement. And when they're in congruence, then your body language makes what you say so much more impactful. And when they are out of alignment, people begin to suspect that what you're saying, you're not totally engaged.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I even heard that in the limbic, body language a lot of the time is controlled by your limbic system.
Yes.
And it's part of the brain that reacts to the world more reflexively and instantaneously without much thought. So even people trained in body language, trying to eliminate some of these things, like what you were just saying, they leak out. So
Yeah.
they're really, it's hard to control, but it's a very accurate measure, especially if you're a competent observer of them, to see their thoughts, their emotions, their feelings about what you're saying or what they're saying and trying to communicate.
Yeah, that limbic system is very interesting because there are lots of body language cues that are culturally determined. But anything that's controlled by the limbic system of the brain is cross-cultural. So that lip compression, by the way, one that I show all the time when I'm doing a program, because I can show leaders from around the world doing the same expression, pulling their lips, it's kind of biting their lips together and pulling them back when they've been asked a question they really didn't want to answer. It's something we do automatically, as is the victory. When your arms go up, you can be anybody in an Olympic event. And if you've won that event, your arms go up. You can be from anywhere around the world. You can be blind from birth and have never seen that gesture. And when you have won your event, your arms go up. So there are a list of those kinds of reactions that are cross-cultural. Other things are very culturally determined. The amount of energy in your voice even is one of those. I had a client who was from Japan. Well, his family was from Japan. He had never actually been there. He's Japanese American, and he'd always wanted to work in Tokyo. So when he had an opportunity to go there, he interviewed for the job that he was overly qualified for. He could have done it with one brain tied behind his back. When he got back, he found he didn't get the job. And he asked one of his friends at the company why he didn't get it. And the friend said, "You were too enthusiastic." See, that American
Wow.
energy in your voice, we can do it, rah, rah, rah,
Right.
probably just was not leadership presence, was not a body language, a nonverbal, was how he said what he said, was not a nonverbal cue that did him well.
Oh, that's some good insight there. So now I'd like to go through some of those common ones, like you were mentioning a few of, and let me know if it's something that has some weight that you think is a reliable indicator versus ones that you feel maybe are not as reliable of an indicator and really kind of a myth that really should be discounted or taken very lightly. Does that sound okay?
Sure.
Now I've heard, and I'm sure I've heard you say this as well, but I know in other books, everyone says to identify or they ask the question, what's the most honest part of someone's body? And what would you say to that statement, Carol?
Yeah, it's your feet.
Exactly. And I've heard reasons as to why it's the farthest from your brain, least under your conscious thought or control. And let's talk about feet pointing. Okay. Feet pointing, meaning when you're in a group of people, the feet are pointing to the person they prefer or the leader of the group. Is that reliable, true, or is it somewhat false?
That's been my experience. When I travel, or when I did travel more than doing virtual programs, I would be by myself a lot. So I would eat by myself. And I was at a restaurant a couple of years ago, and a group of men came in, all men, and they sat around a table. And all I did was look at their feet, and I knew who the boss was
Right.
because the boss was sitting with his feet forward. Everyone else in the meeting or in that table had their feet pointed toward the boss, except for one man whose ankles were crossed and they were pulled back. His feet were pulled back under the chair. And I said, okay, he feels out of this. He doesn't feel like he's one of the group. I know who the boss is. And all I've done is look at their feet.
I've known this to be a very reliable indicator as well. Even in interviews, I've seen where there's glass tables so people can look at what's going on from the waist down. Or even when someone's coming into a room, maybe they're right at the doorway and they're asking a question or getting ready to leave. You can tell if they're engaged with the conversation, if they're pointing at the person, or if their feet are pointing out the door, right? So that they just want to leave, and it's best just to end the conversation sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great indicator, and one that we typically can miss because someone can swivel their upper body towards you and leave their feet pointing in another direction. And we believe the upper body because we haven't noticed the feet.
Great. How about crossing your arms? I mean, this is a big one, right? It causes you to, some studies say it causes you to retain less, learn less because you're more critical of what's being stated. You might have more negative thoughts of the speaker, or you don't agree or want to participate. Accurate indicator?
It's what I've read in the research. And I think it's the reason why, by the way, when you see a speaker on stage and their first comments are, how many of you here are from Texas? They're looking only, they don't care, frankly, if you're from Texas. What they want to do is, if they've noticed a lot of crossed arms, they want to ask a question that allows people to uncross and raise their hand. Because there is some good evidence in research that if they stay with those arms crossed, they're probably not going to retain as much.
I love the way you say that, because effective ways of breaking arms folded position is give them that question, give them something to hold or something to do.
Oh, yeah.
Makes them more receptive.
Hand out your business card, give them a brochure. If you see someone with crossed arms, before you go into your pitch, whatever that pitch is, do something that helps them uncross.
Great advice. I know that Amy Cuddy in her book Presence, she goes through various poses like the Wonder Woman pose or the Superman pose that makes you feel better, more confident. And these poses are, your hands are on your hips, your chest is pushed outward, everything is taking up more room and wider stance. Do these poses really help with your self-confidence and give you more positive emotions, or is that a myth?
You know, it's an interesting quasi myth, only in the fact that the research that they did originally wasn't replicated. Other research universities tried to do the same thing to see if she had some work with it. Your cortisol level goes down and she had some whole aspect of what was happening inside your body. And that's what couldn't be replicated. But I want to tell you, anytime you expand your body, you are going to feel more confident, because it's, again, like that victory thing where your arms go up. When you're having a great day, your body automatically expands. And when you're having a crummy day, you start to get more concave. Your shoulders start to round, your head goes down slightly. We all know that, but there's pretty good evidence that this body-mind connection works the other way. So if you put yourself in that condensed head down posture, you begin to trigger more negative feelings. And if you put yourself in an expansive, shoulders back, arms away from your body, feet a little about hip width, and really down on the ground where you feel like you're grounded, and the minute you do that with your body, you start to feel more confident. You start to feel better. So whether or not all of those hormonal changes take place, I know what happens psychologically, and that's sound.
And in some cases, if it happens psychologically, it's that placebo effect, right? If it helps, then it's something that could be used effectively moving forward. So I could
No,
agree more.
absolutely. And it's not to say that there aren't some hormonal changes that are going on. It's just to say that they haven't, that got into disrepute a bit when it wasn't replicated in other university settings.
Understood. Before we end, I want to talk on one more topic that relates to body language, and that's deception, because I think it can be used effectively to identify certain deceptive behaviors. But the statement that I want you to kind of speak to is that, do you agree with that behaviors that are mistaken for dishonesty are primarily manifestations of stress, not deception?
Absolutely. In fact, that's what you're looking for. You're never looking for lie detection, if you will, because it doesn't exist. What exists is under certain circumstances. If you notice someone's body is responding with a stressful cue, they're rubbing their hands together, they're bouncing their legs, they're, kind of, they look nervous, they're touching their chest, their mouth is dry, they are blocking. If you're one of policemen told me that if he's interviewing someone and they start to block with their coffee cup, they put it in the middle. That may not be a lie, but there's something stressful going on. If they're being absolutely honest and truthful, they tend to move that coffee cup to the side. So there's lots of cues that say something triggered stress. Now, if you've just asked, did you take the laptop from the building last night? And you haven't seen any of these stress cues before they answered, no, I didn't. And then you see these stress cues. You don't automatically know that person is lying, but you know that something triggered stress. So your job then is to ask more questions and see if you can figure out what that is.
Well, it's like with lie detector tests, is they ask those simple questions that they know that they're going to get the right response, and it's simple. So what is your name? What city do you live in? The same way with body language, you have to identify those baseline behaviors, right? So you can differentiate the comfort versus the stress responses. Otherwise, what you're going to be looking for is going to be less reliable.
Absolutely. I had lunch the other day with a man, an executive from Northern California, who says that he realizes that he doesn't give direct eye contact. And because he comes from a culture where that is disrespectful. But he also realizes that there is a myth in this culture around eye contact.
You're
That
right.
if you can't give eye contact, you must have something to hide. You must be deceptive. You must be less than truthful. So he is learning to go against, he's learning a new habit because it fits in the situation that he's in. So absolutely know somebody's baseline before you even start to figure out what is meaningful deviation from that baseline. If he never makes eye contact, then the fact that you've asked him about the missing laptop and he doesn't make eye contact means nothing because that's his baseline behavior.
Well, I agree. And with eye contact, that can be really deceiving because psychopaths, sociopaths make more eye contact than usual. And I found that the blink rate, the pupil dilation is more accurate indicators because it's outside of your conscious control. People can be trained to look and make better eye contact, but it's really hard to adjust those other two things with eye contact that may indicate stress responses or in some cases deception.
Yes. And like you say, in some cases, because eye dilation also happens when you're in love with someone.
Right.
So
Arousal.
if you're in love and lying, you're going to have really big pupils.
Hopefully there's other contextual cues that you could determine or differentiate between the two at that time. But right. Yeah.
That's why it all comes down to context. Again, there's nothing wrong with crossed arms if you're thinking about something. That's how a lot of us kind of pull into our own thoughts. But if you just said, as I saw someone do for a speech for the conference board, and now I'm open for questions, and he crossed his arms tightly, and no one in the audience had a question for this man that they had loved up until that point.
That's great. I know you do the Telltale 4, which you got, it looks like from a Northeastern professor who originated the term, but I love the 4 things that are done in succession that are highly correlated in some cases with someone that's trying to deceive. And that's hand rubbing, face touching, crossing the arms, and leaning away.
Yes. And I think that that's wonderful research. He says if you see those in, like I say, a 5-minute conversation, you have to see all 4 of those, that it's very likely that that person's being deceptive. Now, the interesting part of research on deception also is that when he had little characters, little icons selling that were very cute, selling to an audience, and then he put in the same little cute icons and he had them do in this little sales pitch these 4 gestures, the face touching, hand rubbing, arms crossed, leaning back, that they were very ineffective in making their sales pitch, so that unconsciously an audience were tuned somehow to those 4 signals as being representative of something we need to be more curious about. We need to wonder if we're being honestly spoken to.
That's great. And I've used those and I've found those to be effective as well. So as we reach the end of this episode, I always like to end with a call to action with what we've discussed today. And in today's episode, we identified lots of those, but really, like you state in your programs, in your books, it's pick 1 or 2 of these tips and try them out and practice them. Don't try to tackle all of these things at one time.
Absolutely. Find the one you think is the most fun or the easiest, because I think the most amazing thing about leadership presence is how making one simple change can make a huge difference in how you're perceived. So I usually give this story about a woman who is very trustworthy. At her organization, they did a trust survey, came out very, very poor. And she was mortified because she just had no idea why that could possibly be true, why people perceived her as being less than trustworthy. She asked her boss, and he didn't have a clue. He said, maybe you need to tell us more about the backstory of something before you give us your opinion. I don't know. So she tried that for a year. End of the year, had the same low rating on trustworthiness. She attended a seminar that I gave on body language, and she said, I bet it's something I'm doing with my body. Now, this woman was from North Dakota, where it's a little chilly, and she would actually sit in meetings practically hugging herself for warmth. She decided that not having an open body, not being able to expand and to use her gestures more congruently was probably the problem. So she went out and got a couple of heavy sweaters, just overdressed so that she'd be warm and comfortable enough. And at the end of that year, she got high ratings on trustworthiness. So as I mentioned, maybe all you have to do is go out and buy a sweater.
Love that story, how something so simple could mean so much, right? And have such a significant impact.
Absolutely amazing. And when I coach people or when I do seminars, that's kind of my secret sauce. That's what I know, that if you make one simple change, you will be amazed at the impact of that change.
Well, thank you, Carol, for sharing your insights with us today. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you along with news about your latest book.
Absolutely. You can always email me, Carol at carolkinseygoman.com, or go to my website, which is carolkinseygoman.com. There are articles and little video tips and all sorts of things on that website, and also links to my books. And you can, of course, sign up for my Leadership Presence program for IMS that I am thrilled to be giving again very soon.
When I want to put a plug in for our latest book as well, Stand Out. It's a great book about leadership presence, covering these 5 core qualities in more detail, also giving some great insight and practical tips on body language So great book. It's on Amazon right now. Make sure that if you're interested, get the book, read it. And she's going to be an upcoming educator for IMS this year. And we're so thankful to have her on our educator list and part of the IMS family. This concludes this episode of the IMS Leadership Conversations podcast. You can send us your feedback at info@ims-online.com. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, it can be found on both Apple and Spotify. It can be also accessed on the website of the Institute for Management Studies at ims-online.com. Until next time, remember, it's not what you know, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.